The summer of 2024 was supposed to be a season of renewal in Wyoming's Shoshone National Forest. After a long wet winter, the valleys had burst alive with new growth. Meadows that had been brown and brittle the year before now swayed with tall grasses, wildflowers scattered like confetti and young aspens shimmering in the wind. On the surface it looked like abundance, but every ranger, every biologist, every firefighter who knew this land understood the danger. That much vegetation under the July sun was like dry kindling waiting for a match. The match came on July 18th. A lightning strike during a late afternoon storm cracked into a ridgeline east of Cody. At first, it was nothing more than a faint column of smoke visible only to the few hikers still on the trails. Within hours, the smoke stretched into a towering plume. The heat from weeks of relentless sun had baked the ground bone dry. The wind funneled through the mountain passes, fanning flames with the force of a bellows. By the next morning, fire crews already faced a wall of flame. People who live near Shoshone are no strangers to fire. They've seen smaller burns sweep across the pine barrens before thinning old trees and opening space for new growth. But this fire was different. It roared down canyons, leapt across rivers, and crowned the forest canopy with such speed that even the most seasoned firefighters admitted they had never seen anything move like it. In less than a week, over 150,000 acres had burned. Campgrounds were reduced to ash. Roads twisted with heat damage. Entire slopes of Douglas fir stood like blackened skeletons against an orange sky. For the human residents of Wyoming, the fire meant evacuations, loss of cabins, and a haze of smoke that hung for weeks. But for wildlife, the devastation ran deeper. Grizzly bears, black bears, moose elk. Even the smallest forest animals, chipmunks, rabbits, fox kits, faced a nightmare of firestorms they could not outrun. Some escaped into rocky outcroppings or hidden creeks, but many simply didn't have time. In the days after the fire, rehabilitation centers across the state began receiving a flood of calls: a fawn with scorched hooves, an owl with singed wings, a porcupine coughing from smoke inhalation. At the Shoshone Wildlife Sanctuary, staff kept a running tally on a whiteboard in their intake room. Each day, the numbers climbed. By the second week of August, the board showed over 70 animals admitted since the fire began. Some survived. Some didn't. A quiet room in the back held those who didn't make it, a reminder of how fragile life is in the face of nature's fury. One evening, the sanctuary held a vigil. Staff volunteers and a few neighbors gathered outside beneath a hazy, still glowing sky. They lit candles and placed them on the porch steps, each candle representing a life lost, some known, most only imagined. There was no sermon, no formal speeches, just silence. A child placed a candle for a deer her father had seen trapped on the ridge. A ranger lit one for a bald eagle nest he knew had been destroyed. Claire, the sanctuary director, lit hers for the unnamed. The animals no one had seen, those whose stories ended in the forest without witness. It might seem unusual to hold a vigil for wild animals, but for Claire, it was essential. "We owe them this," she told a volunteer. "If we can't save them all, we can at least remember them." And yet in that same fire, some survivors emerged, creatures who found impossible pockets of safety. That paradox is part of the mystery of wildfires. They destroy, yes, but they also test resilience. A forest fire kills countless living beings, but in its wake, new shoots push through the charred soil. Even the darkest scars carry seeds of renewal. For viewers who might ask, why does this matter to me? Why tell these stories of fire and wildlife? The answer is simple: because what happens to wildlife is a mirror for what happens to us. The same fires that drive bears from their dens also destroy human homes. The same smoke that scars a hawk's lungs also fills the lungs of children in nearby towns. We are connected. To care about forest animals is to care about our own future. There is also a lesson here about abundance and fragility. The very richness of the spring growth had set the stage for disaster. Too much grass, too many saplings, too little balance. Nature is always teaching us about thresholds. When balance is lost, consequences come. And the fire was one of those consequences. Among the stories that emerged from this fire, one stood apart. Days after the flames died down in a ravine near the Absaroka range, rangers spotted something unusual. A small form huddled beneath a half-burned pine so still they almost missed it. At first they thought it was debris, maybe a fallen branch or a mound of earth blackened by smoke. But then it moved. A pair of golden-brown eyes blinked in the dim light. It was a grizzly bear cub, no more than 6 months old. Its fur was mottled with ash, its paws blistered. The little body trembled, though no one was near. Most grizzly bear cubs, when cornered, hiss bawl or charge in wild panic. This one did none of those things. It simply froze as if disappearing might make the world vanish. A ranger whispered, "He's in shock." And that's when the real work of survival began. This is the paradox of wildfire. For every life lost, another emerges with a story of survival. For every acre of blackened soil, another is seeded with the chance of new growth. And for every creature broken by fear, there is a chance, sometimes the smallest chance, that the right connection can make healing possible. The grizzly cub would not be the only survivor of the Shoshone fire, but his path would become something more. He would embody the loss, the grief, and the resilience of the forest itself. And his fate would entwine with that of a woman who believed against all odds that even in the silence of trauma, there is still life waiting to return. And so, as the last embers cooled in the charred valleys of Wyoming, the question remained, could this orphaned cub, hidden away in fear, find a way to live again? The fire had moved on, but the land still smoldered. In the Absaroka range, small pockets of smoke curled from tree stumps and ash carried on the wind like gray snow. Search crews walked the blackened ground looking for flare-ups, checking for hazards, and scanning for wildlife survivors. Most of what they found were signs of absence, footprints that led nowhere. Hollow logs turned to dust, nests collapsed into cinders. But then, in a shallow ravine, Ranger Ethan noticed something different. He was trained to watch movement. In fire zones, survival often comes down to noticing the smallest shifts, a branch that shouldn't be swaying, a patch of dirt that rises with breath. As his team spread out, he froze. At the base of a scorched pine, a shape huddled in the shadows. It didn't run when the crew approached. It didn't even lift its head. Ethan raised his hand to stop the others. "Wait," he whispered. The figure was a grizzly bear cub, no larger than a medium-sized dog, its fur coated with ash, its body trembling, 6 months old, maybe younger. Alone. Ethan had rescued many wild animals during his years in the forest, from owlets fallen from nests to black bear cubs separated from their mothers. But this felt different. Most cubs react with noise, cries, growls, frantic attempts to flee. This cub gave no sound. The silence was unnerving. They approached slowly, but the cub stayed frozen, eyes wide and unblinking. It was survival behavior, but not the usual kind. Typically, a grizzly cub without its mother either bolts or lashes out. Freezing like this signaled something deeper. Shock trauma. Perhaps even the beginnings of what scientists call dissociation. A shutting down of the nervous system when the body can no longer cope with fear. To make sense of what they were seeing, Ethan explained later to the sanctuary staff how predators normally react. A young bear, even one badly frightened, will claw, bite, or flee into cover. They are wired to fight or run. For this cub to stay rooted, unmoving, even as humans approached within a few feet, that meant the fear had gone beyond instinct. He wasn't fighting for his life anymore. He was withdrawing from it. This reaction gave the team urgency. They could not leave him there. The fire had already stripped the hills of berries, roots, and cover. Without his mother, he had no chance of survival. The first 18 months of life are when grizzly cubs learn everything: where to dig, what to eat, how to climb, and how to survive. Winter denning. A cub, without that guidance, is like a child left in the wilderness without language. Ethan crouched low, speaking softly. The cub's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Every move was slow, deliberate. They eased a transport crate forward, There was no struggle when they lifted him, only a faint tremor through his small frame. Some might think that made the rescue easier, but for Ethan it was heartbreaking. A healthy wild animal should resist. He should have scratched, squirmed, fought back. That fight was missing. When the crew loaded him into the truck, Ethan looked back at the blackened ridge. He thought about how many animals they had not reached in time. This cub represented more than just one life. He was a symbol of everything lost, and perhaps of what still might be saved. The drive to the sanctuary was silent except for the occasional rustle inside the crate. Ethan's partner asked what he thought the chances were. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "It depends on whether he wants to live." That comment stayed with the team, because survival, especially for orphaned wildlife, isn't just about medical treatment or food. It's about will. Rescued grizzly bears have been known to recover physically, only to waste away when they cannot adjust to human care. Others, against the odds, fight their way back with surprising strength. The difference often lies in whether they find a reason to re-engage with the world around them. The cub arrived at the Shoshone Wildlife Sanctuary late that night. Staff named him Birch after the trees that managed to grow back quickly after fires. He was placed in an isolation enclosure for observation. Veterinarians treated the blisters on his paws, gave fluids for dehydration, and monitored his breathing for signs of smoke damage. Physically, he was weak but stable. The deeper concern was his behavior. He ate only when the room was empty, moved only under the cover of darkness, and avoided all eye contact. For viewers unfamiliar with wildlife rehabilitation, it's worth understanding why this is unusual. Even traumatized baby animals, whether raccoons, fox kits, or orphaned black bear cubs, usually show some defensive energy. They hiss, they flee, they paw at their cages. That resistance is healthy. It means they are still fighting. Birch's refusal to react was a warning flag. He wasn't fighting, he was shutting down. There's a lesson here, one that reaches beyond wildlife. Trauma doesn't always look like struggle. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes the ones who need the most help are the quietest, the ones who seem to withdraw from the very possibility of connection. For Birch, his silence was not peace. It was a surrender. Still, the staff didn't give up. They knew that healing isn't linear. Just as the forest would eventually sprout green through the ashes, so too might Birch's spirit find renewal, given time and patience. Claire, the sanctuary director, reminded her team of that lesson during a morning briefing. He's still alive. As long as he's alive, there's hope. From another perspective, Birch's discovery also raised a larger question about our role in conservation. When humans intervene, what are we really doing? We cannot replace a mother bear's teachings. We cannot return every lost cub to the wild. But we can offer a chance, however imperfect, for survival. And sometimes that chance becomes enough. Ethan, reflecting later, admitted he almost walked past that ravine. The cub was so still he blended with the ash. "If I hadn't looked twice, I would have missed him," he said. That detail carried its own lesson, how much in life we overlook when we don't slow down, when we assume the world is only what's visible at first glance. The cub was hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. This story of discovery echoes through many wild animal stories. Resilience often hides quietly, almost invisibly, until the right eyes see it. A small bird limping by the roadside, a fox kit crouched in a culvert, a baby grizzly bear pressed against a fallen tree. They are reminders that survival is often silent, waiting for recognition. By the end of his first week at the sanctuary, Birch had not yet made progress, but his presence had already altered the staff. They began to see the fire not only as destruction, but as a backdrop for resilience. They had lost much fawns, raptors, countless unnamed forest animals, but here was one life that carried possibility. And possibility can be enough to keep people going. For the audience watching, there's another takeaway: recovery from trauma. Whether for wildlife or for us, often begins not with action, but with recognition. Seeing the hidden pain, acknowledging it, and creating space for healing. Birch's story teaches us to look twice to notice the quiet survivors in our own lives. Yet recognition was only the beginning. Birch had been discovered, yes, but discovery alone doesn't guarantee recovery. The real challenge was just starting. Could anyone reach him, break through that silence, and remind him that life was still worth living? The first nights after Birch's arrival at the Shoshone Wildlife Sanctuary were the hardest. Staff rotated in shifts, checking the cameras trained on his enclosure, logging each detail. For a baby grizzly bear, silence is rarely a good sign. Cubs are supposed to fuss, cry, and paw at their den. Birch did none of that. When humans were present, he pressed himself flat against the corner. When food was placed inside, he would not touch it until the room was empty. The only proof of life came from the overnight footage at 2 a.m., a faint figure moving in circles, pacing tight loops until exhaustion forced him down. Claire, the director, watched those clips with a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief because he was eating however little. Sorrow because the behavior spoke louder than words. Pacing in wild animals often means stress. It means the body wants to flee, but the mind feels trapped. It is the movement of an animal searching for something it cannot find. For the staff, the silence carried its own weight. They were used to difficult cases. Black bears are hit by cars, eagles with fractured wings, even grizzlies are injured during hunting conflicts. Those animals often fought through treatment, clawing, hissing, and sometimes even lunging at the very people trying to save them. But strangely, that aggression was hopeful. It meant the animal still had its will. Birch was different. His refusal to fight worried everyone more than the burns on his paws. Kelsey, the behavioral specialist, noted her observations in neat handwriting. Avoids eye contact. Eats only in the absence of people. Responds to no vocal cues. Displays repetitive pacing. She looked up at Claire one morning and said quietly, "If he doesn't engage soon, we may have to prepare for the worst." It was the kind of statement no one wanted to hear, but everyone knew was possible. Wild animal rescues don't always end in release. And yet, even in this silence, there were small signals. One night, as a volunteer carried water to the enclosure, Birch's ears flicked at the sound. He didn't move otherwise, but he was listening. That was enough to give the team hope. Listening meant awareness. Awareness meant something inside him was still awake. Here it helps to understand why cubs like Birch face such steep odds. In the wild, a mother bear teaches survival. She shows her cubs how to fish in a stream, how to dig roots, and how to den before winter. Without her, a cub is like a child with no teacher. Rehabilitation centers can provide food and medical care, but they cannot replace the lessons of instinct passed down through generations. Many orphaned cubs, released too soon, either starve or approach humans seeking food only to end up in conflict. That's why sanctuaries tread so carefully. They want to prepare cubs for the wild without making them dependent on people. Birch's challenge was deeper still, his refusal to connect at all. Claire often stayed late reviewing his file under the glow of her office lamp. She remembered other grizzly bears they had cared for, like a cub named Aspen, who came in half-starved but recovered quickly once she began climbing trees in her pen. Aspen was released within the year, now tracked in Yellowstone, thriving. Birch wasn't Aspen. He wasn't fighting to live. That difference gnawed at her. One night, unable to sleep, she phoned her sister. She spoke softly so the other staff wouldn't overhear. "He's just empty," she confessed. "I've seen fear before. I've seen anger. But this, it's like he's already gone, but his body hasn't caught up yet." Her sister reminded her of a truth Claire already knew but sometimes forgot. Not every story ends in rescue. Still, Claire couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, Birch was waiting for something different. For viewers, it's easy to assume healing is about medicine, treat the burns, give fluids, provide food, and the animal will recover. But Birch's silence teaches a more complex truth. Healing requires more than physical care. It requires a connection. Without it, even the strongest body can falter. That's why trauma in wildlife mirrors trauma in people. Some wounds are invisible, and they take longer to mend than the ones we can see. There's another perspective here, one that sanctuary staff often reflect on. Wild animals are not pets. They are not meant to bond with humans in the same way. The goal is always to prepare them for independence. And yet, paradoxically, to reach that independence, many animals must first accept a small bridge of trust. Too much bonding and they can't survive in the wild. Too little and they won't survive at all. Birch was teetering on that edge, and no one knew which way he would fall. By the end of the second week, the team held a meeting. They sat around a worn wooden table, coffee cups, scattered notes spread out. Claire began by reviewing the medical updates. Burns, healing, hydration stable, no sign of infection. Then came the behavioral report. Kelsey shook her head. No progress, if anything more withdrawn. Silence fell over the group. Someone finally asked the question everyone dreaded. Do we have a timeline? Claire exhaled. We can't keep him forever. If he won't accept minimal care, we may have to make a decision. The words hung heavy. Audiences need to understand what a decision means in wildlife care. It doesn't mean giving up easily. It means facing the reality that keeping a wild animal alive without quality of life can be a cruelty of its own. Sanctuaries must weigh compassion with practicality. Space is limited, resources stretched. Every case carries costs, and those costs are balanced against the chance of survival. Birch was tipping toward the wrong side of that balance. And yet, the story wasn't finished, because hidden within those silent days was a seed of possibility. The cameras showed it first, a pause in his pacing when a caretaker read aloud outside the door. A faint shift of his gaze when someone lingered quietly instead of walking away. These were not breakthroughs, but they were not nothing. They were whispers of a will still buried beneath fear. For us, the lesson is subtle but powerful. Sometimes progress is not visible in leaps, but in pauses. Not in loud victories, but in quiet hesitations. Birch's silence seemed like absence, but in truth, it was also a kind of waiting. And waiting can be its own form of survival. Claire decided to give him more time. Another week, she told the staff. We owe him that much. She didn't know what would change, but she knew giving up too soon could mean losing a chance they hadn't yet seen. From a wider perspective, Birch's struggle also reframes how we view wildlife rescue. It reminds us that every wild animal story is layered. Behind every cute image of baby animals or rare animals saved on camera lies weeks of uncertainty, failure, and waiting. The videos often show the moment of release, the door opening, the animal running free, but rarely do they show the silent days in between, the days filled with doubt. Birch's story forces us to sit with that silence and recognize it as part of the process. For the sanctuary team, those days stretched on. Each night they checked the cameras, each morning they reviewed the notes. And each time the question loomed, would Birch ever choose to live fully again? The answer didn't come through medicine or force. It came unexpectedly through a connection no one had planned, from a woman who sat down outside Birch's enclosure and changed everything. By the third week at the sanctuary, hope had thinned. Birch was alive, but only just. His body was healing, but his spirit still hid in the dark corners of his enclosure. Staff followed routines, food at dawn, medical checks in the afternoon, quiet monitoring at night. Nothing broke through. He paced when no one was near, froze when anyone approached, and pressed into silence whenever a hand or a voice tried to reach him. It was survival, but it wasn't living. Claire knew they were running out of time. She also knew from years of caring for wild animals that sometimes when the standard methods fail, what's left is patience. And patience is not a treatment you can measure on a chart. It is simply showing up. So she tried something different. Instead of entering Birch's enclosure with food or standing at the gate to observe, she sat down on the floor outside the wire wall a few feet back, cross-legged, like she was there to rest. She brought a worn wildlife management manual, the same one she had used years earlier when studying black bear behavior, and began to read aloud. Her voice was calm, steady, neither loud nor soft, just present. She didn't watch him directly. She let the words carry into the quiet, filling the space with something gentle. For almost an hour, she read not about Birch, not about fire, but about the daily rhythms of forest animals, the way grizzly bears dig for roots, the way cubs learn from their mothers, the way seasons shape survival. To an outsider, it may have seemed pointless. To Claire, it was an offering. When she closed the book and rose to leave, she turned her head just enough to notice something she hadn't seen before. Birch was still in his corner, but his eyes were following her. It was the first time he had initiated eye contact. It lasted only a moment, but it was a moment she had been waiting for. The next morning, she repeated the ritual. She sat, she read, she ignored him without ignoring his presence. Slowly, the routine became part of his world. Each day, his gaze lingered a little longer. Each day, the silence shifted, not broken, but less heavy. For those unfamiliar with wildlife behavior, this might sound like a small thing. But in rehabilitation, eye contact from a traumatized animal is not just looking, it is acknowledgement. It means the animal is beginning to notice something beyond fear. Birch wasn't ready to trust, but he was ready to see. And seeing is the first step toward connection. Here lies a lesson not only about grizzly bears, but about healing in general. We often assume that progress comes from doing fixing, intervening, speaking louder, trying harder. Yet sometimes the most powerful act is presence without demand. By sitting quietly, Claire permitted Birch to exist without pressure. In that quiet acceptance, he found the courage to lift his eyes. The sanctuary staff noticed the difference quickly. Kelsey wrote in her notes, "Observed visual tracking during reading session." First sign of interest. For the first time, she allowed herself a hint of optimism. He might still come through, she told Claire. This shift also opened a fresh perspective on how humans and wild animals meet each other in moments of crisis. We think of ourselves as rescuers, saviors, swooping in to fix what is broken. But in truth, sometimes we are simply companions in the waiting. Birch did not need Claire to erase his trauma. He needed her to stand beside it quietly until he could carry it himself. It reminds us too of how healing often works in people. Think of those who grieve, who withdraw into silence after loss. Words of comfort may not always reach them. What matters is presence, the steady, non-demanding presence of someone willing to sit nearby until the silence softens. Birch's unlikely connection with Claire is not only a wildlife story, it is a mirror held up to our own lives. In the days that followed, the connection deepened. Birch did not approach her yet, but his ears turned toward her voice. He shifted positions when she arrived, no longer shrinking fully into the corner. It was as if he was testing the air, testing the possibility that not every presence meant danger. Claire kept her sessions short, never pushing, never expecting. She knew the smallest crack in silence can become the doorway to trust. Other staff members began to adapt their approach. Instead of quick movements, they slowed down. Instead of trying to engage him directly, they mirrored Claire's patience. Soon, Birch was tolerating their presence too, not with comfort, but without collapse. It was enough. For viewers watching Birch's story unfold, there's a truth worth carrying. Connection does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in the quiet choices to show up again and again, even when nothing seems to change. That is what Claire embodied. She was not extraordinary in her methods. She was extraordinary in her willingness to wait. From another angle, Birch's response also provided scientists with a point of interest. Trauma in large carnivores is poorly documented. Most wildlife studies focus on population numbers, diet range, and reproduction. Few examine psychological scars. Birch's gradual shift ears, turning gaze, following body relaxing, was a rare glimpse into how a traumatized bear might begin to re-engage with life. This was not just a rescue story. It was data insight into the hidden world of animal resilience. Claire understood the stakes. She knew that if Birch did not reach a minimum threshold of engagement, his future was grim. Sanctuaries cannot release animals that refuse to interact at all, nor can they keep every orphan indefinitely. Resources are limited. The fact that Birch was showing signs of connection meant his survival odds had just changed. The staff gathered again after a week of Claire's quiet sessions. This time the mood was lighter. Kelsey reported, "He watches her now. Not every time, but enough that we know he's present." Ethan added, "When I walked past yesterday, he didn't bolt, just sat and looked." Claire didn't overstate it. "It's small," she said, "but small is enough right now." From a storytelling view, it's tempting to frame this as a miracle. But what makes it powerful is that it wasn't a miracle. It was ordinary patience meeting extraordinary need. Birch didn't suddenly leap into Claire's arms. He didn't transform overnight. What changed was the slow shift from absence to presence, from silence to acknowledgement. That is how healing often begins, not with dramatic breakthroughs, but with quiet consistency. For those listening, the takeaway is clear. In both people and wildlife, the bridge to trust can be as simple as sitting still, offering presence without demand. Healing is less about fixing and more about allowing. That perspective, if we carry it into our own relationships, can change how we show up for those around us. Still, the question remained. Birch was noticing. He was watching. But would he take the next step? Would he move toward her or anyone and accept the care that could determine his future? The sanctuary had given him more time, but time was not endless. And then one quiet afternoon, Birch made his choice not with a roar or a leap, but with 3 hesitant steps that would change everything. The days of quiet watching of Claire, sitting outside Birch's enclosure with her book, had built a rhythm. Each afternoon, the sanctuary grew still, the staff lowering their voices as she settled into her spot. Birch would stay in his corner, his body pressed against the wall, but his eyes followed her movements now. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was attention, and in a wild animal story, like his attention is a signal of life returning. The breakthrough came in a moment so small that at first Claire almost missed it. She had been reading again, not for him exactly, but to keep herself steady. The manual's words were dry lists of feeding patterns, habitat ranges, and seasonal behaviors of forest animals. Yet her tone was steady, the same as she would use if telling a child a bedtime story. Birch sat as usual, motionless in his shadowed corner. Then, without warning, he shifted. One paw, then another. 3 slow steps forward. The staff, watching through the camera monitors, gasped. To anyone else, it might not have looked like much a cub, simply moving inside his enclosure. But to those who had witnessed his silence, his paralysis, those 3 steps were everything. For the first time since the fire, Birch had chosen to move toward, not away. Claire kept her voice even, her body still. She did not lean in. She knew that rushing to meet him could undo the fragile thread forming between them. She simply kept reading even as her heart raced. Birch stopped halfway, his ears forward, his nose twitching as if testing the air between them. The distance was still many feet, but the shift was undeniable. Why does this matter? Because in the language of wildlife rehabilitation, small changes carry big meaning. A grizzly bear cub who has shut down, who refuses food in company, who avoids all contact, is 1 step away from giving up. When that same cub takes steps toward another living being, it signals the possibility of recovery. The body is beginning to choose life again. The lesson here is one we often overlook in our own lives. Healing rarely arrives with a single dramatic moment. It arrives quietly, in small choices repeated over time. A person who has withdrawn begins to answer the phone again. A child grieving loss raises their eyes for the first time in weeks. A cub who has hidden in silence takes 3 hesitant steps forward. These are not final victories. They are beginnings. But beginnings are where hope takes root. For the sanctuary staff, Birch's movement changed the energy of the entire facility. Volunteers who had been dreading the possibility of euthanasia now spoke of his future. Ethan, the ranger who had found him, came to watch and whispered, "He's still in there." Even Kelsey, who had been the most cautious in her assessments, allowed herself a smile. This is the crack we needed. Claire, though, kept her perspective. 1 moment doesn't mean he's healed, she reminded them. It just means he's trying. And that's enough for today. She wrote in his file, approached front of enclosure 3 steps. It was the simplest of notes, but it carried more weight than pages of medical updates. This breakthrough also provided a fresh angle for scientists studying wildlife trauma. Birch's case illustrated something often missed in the study of endangered animals. Rehabilitation usually focuses on the body treating wounds, providing food, and preparing for release. Yet here was evidence that the mind, the psychological resilience of a young grizzly, could determine outcomes just as much as physical strength. What if sanctuaries began to incorporate not only medical protocols, but also behavioral patients' presence and non-invasive connection? Birch was quietly teaching humans as much as they were teaching him. Over the next days, Birch repeated the behavior. At first, it was just those 3 steps. Then retreat. Then it became 5 steps. Then a slow circle that brought him near the enclosure gate before slipping back again. Each time, Claire resisted the urge to celebrate too loudly. Progress with trauma is fragile. Push too hard, and regression follows. She allowed him to set the pace, honoring the rhythm he chose. The sanctuary began adjusting routines around these sessions. Feeding times were shifted so Birch could eat while Claire sat outside. Medical checks were scheduled after her visits when his body seemed less tense. Other staff members, following her example, also began sitting quietly outside enclosures of more anxious animals. A fox kit who had lost its siblings, a hawk recovering from smoke inhalation. Birch's breakthrough was already rippling outward. For viewers listening to Birch's story, there's a perspective worth holding. Sometimes our own small breakthroughs are overlooked because they don't look dramatic enough. We measure success in big milestones, graduations, recoveries, releases. But in truth, the moments that matter are often the quiet ones. No one sees a choice to try again, to step forward, to breathe more fully. Birch's 3 steps remind us to honor our own hidden progress. And there was another layer. Claire later admitted that Birch's movement changed her too. She had spent weeks fearing she might preside over another loss, one more cub who couldn't return to the wild. His small step gave her renewed patience. It reminded her why she chose this work, not for the guarantees, but for the possibility that even one life could turn. "He's teaching us," she said quietly to Ethan one evening. "He's teaching us that healing doesn't come when we demand it. It comes when we wait with it." This is the paradox of animal rescue. We step in thinking we are the ones saving them, but often it is the animals who teach us what survival and courage truly mean. Birch was no different. His silence had held a mirror to the limits of human control. His small step forward reflected the power of persistence without expectation. The sanctuary began documenting his progress not only for his case file but for broader research. They noted how long he would stay near the gate, whether he would eat while being observed, and how often he repeated the behavior. It became a living record of resilience, a dataset wrapped inside a story. Scientists talk about transformative cases, moments when one individual animal shifts understanding for an entire field. Birch was becoming one of those cases. By the end of the month, Birch had approached within a few feet of the gate, while Claire sat reading. He still kept his distance, but he no longer pressed himself into the corner. He no longer paced all night. His breathing steadied, his eyes brighter. There was no single day when he was suddenly better, but the trend was undeniable. He was returning to life. The staff felt it too. Volunteers lingered longer by his enclosure. Claire no longer dreaded opening his file each morning. Even visitors at the sanctuary, though not allowed to see Birch, directly heard whispers of the cub who had begun to walk again. Hope has a way of multiplying. Still, one question hovered over the sanctuary. Like the last smoke of the fire, could Birch's fragile steps toward trust grow strong enough to carry him back into the wild, where survival meant more than approaching a human voice? The time was coming to decide not just if he could live, but if he could live free. By late autumn, Birch was no longer the silent cub found beneath a burned tree. He was heavier now, muscles filling out with proper food. His fur had grown back thick, hiding the scars on his paws. He no longer hid in the corner when people passed. Instead, he explored his enclosure with curiosity, sniffing at logs, rolling in the straw, and pawing at the water trough. For the first time, the sanctuary staff began asking a new question. What would his future look like? The mission of every animal sanctuary is not to keep wildlife forever, but to return them to their home when possible. The staff knew the risks. Grizzly bear cubs without mothers rarely survive alone in the wild. A mother bear normally spends 2 to 3 years teaching her cubs everything: how to dig for tubers, how to find grubs beneath fallen logs, how to fish in rivers swollen with spring melt. Without those lessons, many orphans don't make it through their first winter. Birch's recovery had given him a second chance, but the question was whether that chance could extend beyond sanctuary walls. Claire gathered the team around the table where Birch's file had been lying open for months. The notes told his story in short fragments. Initial shock, frozen response. Approached 3 steps. Eating with human presence. Pause, healed. Now the file needed a new entry. Evaluate release potential. Kelsey, the behavioral specialist, was cautious. "He's stronger," she said. "He's engaging, but he still relies on us more than a wild cub should. If we release him too soon, he might seek out people for food. And that ends badly for him and for the people." Ethan, the ranger who had discovered him, leaned forward. "I've seen him forage on his own," he said. "I watched him dig for roots in the back corner." He pawed at the log we placed, turned it over, and pulled out beetle larvae. "That's instinct. That means something." They debated for hours. Every wild animal story at this stage carries the same tension, the balance between safety and care, and freedom and risk. Sanctuaries are not meant to be permanent homes for bears. The enclosures, no matter how large, cannot replicate the open range of forest animals. And yet releasing too soon can condemn an animal to failure. For viewers, it's important to see the complexity. Rescue is not the end of the story. In fact, it is often just the middle. The true measure of success is not survival in captivity, but survival in the wild. That is what makes this stage both hopeful and heavy. To guide their decision, Claire contacted the state's wildlife department. Together, they reviewed data on grizzly bear reintroductions. Out of every group of orphaned cubs, released only a portion thrives. Some fail to establish territory. Some come too close to human settlements. Some simply disappear. Yet there are also success stories, cubs who not only survive, but grow into healthy adults, contributing to the fragile population of grizzlies in the lower 48. These endangered animals remain under protection, and each successful release strengthens the species as a whole. The data was sobering, but it gave perspective. "If we keep him here," Claire told the team, "he will never know freedom. If we release him, he may fail, but he also may succeed. And if he succeeds, his life will matter far beyond these walls." As weeks passed, they began preparing Birch for the possibility of release. His diet was shifted gradually to mimic what he would find in the wild: roots, berries, insects, and occasional fish from a nearby stream. Human contact was reduced. Staff limited their presence, speaking less and entering his space only when necessary. Birch responded with more independence. He grew bolder in foraging, tearing apart logs with powerful swipes, pawing at the ground to dig dens. The wildness in him was returning. One afternoon, Ethan observed Birch climbing a tree in his enclosure. His claws gripped the bark, his body pulling upward with surprising strength. At the top, he paused, sniffing the air. It was an ordinary action for a bear, but for Ethan it was proof Birch still carried the instincts of his kind. He turned to Claire and said simply, "He's ready." Still, no one took the decision lightly. Claire wrote in her journal, "We have given him every chance. The rest will be up to him." That sentence captured the heart of every release. Human care can only carry an animal so far. The final test belongs to the wild. Here lies a lesson that extends beyond wildlife. Sometimes, no matter how much we want to protect someone, the truest form of love is letting them go. Birch's story reminds us that safety is not the same as life. Life requires risk. It requires trust that resilience will carry forward when support is no longer present. From another perspective, Birch's preparation also highlighted how sanctuaries serve not only animals, but people. For the staff, this process was healing too. They had watched him emerge from silence, seen him reclaim instinct, and now they were witnesses to his transformation. His journey had mirrored their own belief in patience, persistence, and the possibility of renewal after devastation. The sanctuary set a date mid-October. The Absaroka range had been surveyed. The area chosen for release had stable water sources, abundant food, and minimal human activity. Remote cameras were already in place. Birch would be fitted with a tracking collar so his progress could be monitored without interference. In the final days before release, Claire visited his enclosure one more time. She sat as she had months before, book in hand, though this time she didn't read aloud. She simply sat, watching him forage, watching him live. Birch glanced at her briefly, then returned to his digging. That was enough. He no longer needed her presence to survive. For those listening, the fresh perspective is this: preparation for freedom is not about making an animal dependent on us. It is about reminding them who they are. Birch was not meant to be a resident of an animal sanctuary. He was meant to be a grizzly bear of the Wyoming wilderness. Every step of his rehabilitation was aimed not at taming him, but at returning him to himself. The night before release, the staff gathered once more at the wooden table. They did not know what the next chapter would hold. Success or failure, freedom or loss, they had done their part. Birch would carry the rest. They raised mugs of coffee and a quiet toast, not of celebration, but of gratitude. To Birch, Claire said softly, "May he find his way." And so, as the sun rose on a crisp October morning, the gate to Birch's enclosure opened one last time, not into straw and fences, but into the mountains where the wild waited to decide his fate. The morning of Birch's release began before sunrise. The mountains were still wrapped in mist, the air cold enough that every breath left a trace of smoke-like vapor. The sanctuary team gathered quietly, each person carrying the weight of what was about to happen. Birch was loaded into a transport crate, calm but alert, his golden brown eyes scanning each shadow. For months, he had been the silent cub in the corner. Now he was about to face the test that mattered most, life on his own. The chosen site lay deep in the Absaroka range, far from human roads and cabins. It had streams full of trout hillsides rich with berries and sheltering pines where a grizzly bear could dig a winter den. It was by every measure a suitable habitat. But suitable is not the same as certain. Release always carries risk. No matter how carefully the setting is chosen, the wild does not guarantee survival. The team worked methodically. Ethan checked the tracking collar one last time, ensuring the signal was strong. Kelsey reviewed the notes on foraging behavior. Claire stood by the crate, her hand resting lightly on the latch. They all knew that once the door opened, Birch's story would belong to the wilderness, not to them. When the moment came, Claire crouched near the crate. She spoke softly, not because she expected Birch to understand the words, but because she needed to say them. "This is your home now. Go find it." She pulled the latch. For a long moment, nothing happened. Birch remained inside, his nose lifted, testing the air. Release is rarely dramatic. Many animals dash out immediately, desperate for space. But Birch was deliberate. He took a single step forward, then stopped, his paws resting on the grass, his body still half inside the crate. He looked back once, not at anyone in particular, just back perhaps at the months of safety, perhaps at the quiet voices that had carried him through silence. Then he moved forward again. One step, then another. His body shifted fully into the clearing. He sniffed at the ground, pawed lightly at the soil, and finally turned toward the tree line. With surprising speed, he broke into a run. The sound of his paws thudded against the earth, his fur rippled in the cool air, and then he vanished into the forest, swallowed by the trees. The clearing was quiet afterward. The team stood still, listening for any sign, but there was only the rustle of wind in the branches. It was both an ending and a beginning. Why does this moment matter? Because release is the culmination of every effort made in an animal sanctuary. Feeding, tending, waiting, hoping, all of it leads to this single act of opening a door. It is also the most humbling moment. Caretakers know that from here, control ends. They can no longer decide what Birch eats, where he sleeps, or how he survives. They can only trust that the instincts within him will rise to meet the challenge of the wild. The lesson here is one we all face. Letting go is never easy, but holding on too tightly can prevent the very life we are trying to protect. Birch's release illustrates that love is not possession. True care allows freedom even when freedom carries risk. From a wider perspective, his release also symbolized something beyond one cub. Grizzly bears in the lower 48 states remain an endangered population. Once they roamed across much of North America. Today, their numbers are confined to isolated ranges in Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and parts of Washington. Each bear that returns to the wild strengthens not only the species, but the ecosystems they shape. Grizzlies are keystone species forest animals whose digging, foraging, and hunting affect countless other creatures. By surviving, Birch would contribute to the balance of the land itself. The sanctuary staff didn't cheer when the crate emptied. Instead, they stood in quiet respect. They knew that release is not about victory for humans. It is about restoring the wild to itself. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve and whispered, "He belongs there." That whisper carried a deeper truth. Sanctuaries exist not to replace wilderness, but to give endangered animals like Birch the chance to return to it. They are bridges, not destinations. Birch's story, like so many wild animal stories before him, reminds us that our role is temporary. The goal is always independence. In the days that followed, the tracking collar confirmed what their eyes could not. Birch was moving. At first, his range was small, circling near the release site. Then gradually the signal showed wider arcs. He explored valleys, crossed streams, and climbed ridges. He was expanding, claiming a territory of his own. For the staff, each ping of the satellite felt like a heartbeat. Visitors to the sanctuary often asked what had become of him. Is he safe? Is he thriving? The staff explained what they knew. The collar data showed movement consistent with foraging and exploration. They explained that while no one could promise certainty, Birch was alive, and that alone was enough. For audiences, this part of his journey offers another fresh perspective. The wilderness is not ours to control, but it is ours to protect. Each time we create space for wildlife to live freely, we acknowledge that their survival is linked with our own. Birch's release was not only his story, it was part of the larger story of conservation, of human responsibility, of the ongoing relationship between people and the natural world. And yet, even in this moment of hope, mystery lingered. What would become of him in winter when the snow fell and the mountains hardened? Would he find enough food to fatten before denning? Would he face rival bears or wolves, or the silent threats of starvation the team could not know? All they could do was trust the instincts within him, instincts stronger than any training they could offer. This is where Birch's story turns back toward us. We too carry instincts for resilience. We too face winters of hardship and firestorms of loss. And like Birch, we survive not by eliminating risk, but by moving forward into uncertainty, trusting the strength that lies deeper than fear. As the sanctuary truck wound back down the mountain road that day, the crate empty in the back, Claire looked out across the valleys below. The land still bore scars of the fire, blackened ridges, slopes of fallen timber. But here and there, green was returning. Shoots of grass, patches of wildflowers, saplings rising defiantly from ash. It mirrored Birch's journey. From silence to steps, from enclosure to forest, from survival to the possibility of thriving. Months would pass before the staff would see proof of what had become of him. But when they did through the lens of a remote camera, they would discover that Birch's story was not just about survival. It was about resilience, renewal, and the healing bond between people and the wild. Winter came quickly to the Absaroka range. The first snow covered the blackened slopes where the fire had raged only months earlier. Remote cameras captured images of elk moving in herds, coyotes pressing narrow trails through the drifts, and a single grizzly bear cub collar visible padding through the snow. Birch was alive. Each ping from his tracking collar brought relief to the sanctuary team. Data showed him exploring ridges, resting near streams, and digging shallow dens. He had not wandered toward towns. He had not lingered near roads. He was living as a grizzly bear, should wild, cautious, independent. For a cub who once refused even to look up from the corner of an enclosure, this was a triumph. By spring, the cameras showed more. Birch emerged from his den lean but strong. He foraged along berry thickets, pulled apart rotting logs, and fished clumsily in mountain streams. He was learning what his mother would have taught him, but he was learning by instinct, by trial and error. Each image became part of a growing record, not just of one cub, but of what is possible when wildlife is given a chance. Claire often drove into the mountains to check the data herself. One afternoon, she stood on a ridge where the fire had burned hottest. New grass covered the slope and shoots of aspen stretched toward the ski. In the distance, she saw movement, just a shape, a shadow slipping between trees. She didn't call out. She didn't move closer. She simply stood still, knowing Birch was somewhere out there living the life he was born for. Why does this ending matter? Because it proves that healing is possible even when beginnings look hopeless. Birch's transformation from a silent, withdrawn cub to a thriving young bear reminds us that resilience often hides beneath layers of fear. Given time, patience, and the right kind of connection, that resilience can rise again. The lesson is not just about one animal. It is about all living beings, people included. We too carry scars from fires, sometimes literal, sometimes emotional. We too withdraw into silence when the weight of life feels too heavy. Birch teaches us that recovery is not about erasing the past. It is about taking hesitant steps forward, learning to trust again, and returning to the wildness of life. From a knowledge perspective, his survival also highlights the importance of conservation science. Grizzly bears remain an endangered species in parts of the United States. Every cub that thrives strengthens the fragile population. Each release that succeeds provides data for biologists studying how orphaned cubs adapt. Birch's story is not only emotional, it is evidence that animal rescue and sanctuaries are vital for both individual lives and species survival. But perhaps the deepest impact of his story is emotional. Birch did not heal alone. His recovery was shaped by human patience, by a woman who chose to sit quietly outside his enclosure instead of forcing him into contact. That choice changed his life, and in return he changed hers, reminding her and everyone watching that true connection often grows in silence. This bond between a human and a grizzly bear cub was never about taming. It was about trust, respect, and the courage to let go when the time came. Here lies a fresh perspective. Animal rescue is not a one-way act of saving. It is a relationship. Wild animals teach us about resilience, patience, and the limits of our control. Birch's journey reminds us that in caring for wildlife, we also rediscover parts of ourselves. Our compassion, our endurance, our own instinct to survive and protect. Months later, the sanctuary staff received an image from one of the remote cameras. Birch stood on a hilltop at dusk, the scar on his paw barely visible beneath thick fur. Behind him stretched the recovering forest green shoots, rising where ash had once settled. It was a picture not only of a bear, but of renewal itself. The forest was healing, so was Birch. And, in a way, so were the people who had carried him through silence. For you watching this story, there is an invitation hidden here. Birch's survival is not just a wild animal story to witness and forget. It is a mirror. Where in your life have you pulled back into silence? Where have you stayed in the corner, too afraid to move forward, and who has been willing to sit quietly beside you, offering presence without pressure? If Birch could take 3 hesitant steps toward life again, perhaps you can too. Healing is rarely loud. It often begins with a whisper, a pause, a choice to try once more. His journey is a reminder that resilience belongs to all of us, human and animal, forest and fire, silence and sound. And now, the story returns to you. If Birch's journey touched your heart, let it guide you to reflect on your own resilience. Ask yourself, what part of me is ready to step out of the corner and move forward, then carry that answer with you, knowing that even small steps matter. Finally, if this story of an orphaned grizzly bear reminded you of the strength we all carry, help us continue sharing these true wild animal stories. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder of hope today. Together we can honor wildlife, protect endangered animals, and keep alive the truth that even after fire, life finds its way back.